I want to begin by sharing with you two reasons that I think are at the top of our list as to why liberty is superior to any other system. And the first is that it really isn't a system at all, in the sense that it does not require the concoction of any master planner, any imaginary mastermind to plan the lives of others. Liberty is what happens when you leave people alone. Liberty is what happens when people respect the lives and the property and the rights of others. All other systems are concoctions and contrivances that depend upon the fantasies of a few people who think they can plan the lives of others. The second reason I think we should champion on liberty's behalf is that it's the only system that requires high standards of personal character. It's the only one. I think that speaks volumes about the inherent virtue of liberty. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean about high standards of character? I like to say to audiences that anybody can be a socialist. Anybody can be an interventionist, a statist, whatever term you may choose to describe those who put faith in the state. It really, none of those contrivances really demand much of us. All it takes, in any case, is to demand or expect something that isn't yours and have the willingness to deploy force to get it. Bingo, that's all it takes. And you're the socialist, the statist. No character standards are required. But liberty is different because it calls all of us to some very lofty and noble standards. We need to be asking ourselves every day, am I good enough for liberty? It's the one system, if you will, that requires that people widely practice things like honesty, keeping your word. It requires patience, it requires courage, perseverance, persistence, responsibility, and humility. Humility not in the sense of self-deprecation, but humility in the sense of understanding as much as we may know, there is a universe of knowledge we don't yet know. And the very thought that any of us could plan for the lives of others in the kind of minute detail that so many in Washington fantasize that they're able to do is preposterous. So character is something that liberty calls us to uphold. And I think the best way to explain this is to talk about great men and women of solid character. And that's where I'd like to go with the remainder of the speech. You know, the liberty movement didn't begin with your generation or mine. We stand on the shoulders of a great many men and women, in some cases going back many centuries. And in many of those cases, men and women who put their lives on the line so that others could be free. So it behooves us, I think, to remind ourselves from time to time of the greatness of some of those people on whose shoulders we stand. I've chosen 4 tonight to tell you stories about. The first one is a man named Thomas Clarkson, named for one of my dogs, or my dog's is named after him. How many of you have seen the movie Amazing Grace? Okay, if you haven't, I highly recommend it. You may recall, if you saw that movie, that its central figure is William Wilberforce, who was the anti-slavery man in Parliament in Britain in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The movie does talk about and feature an actor who portrays Thomas Clarkson, but the message is Wilberforce was the main guy. He certainly is the one who gets the most historical credit for ending the slave trade and then later slavery itself. But I'm one of those who thinks, as Wilberforce himself did, that the success of that movement couldn't have happened had it not been for this other man, Thomas Clarkson. I've written about him in an essay entitled, I think being students you'll appreciate this, the essay is entitled, A Student's Essay That Changed the World. Here's his story. In the 1780s, Thomas Clarkson was a young student at Cambridge University. His plan was to become an Anglican minister. But an event on the high seas would change his life. And because it changed his life, it would ultimately change the course and the conscience of a nation. That incident involved a slave ship by the name of the Zong. Like slave ships of that day that left ports in Britain like Portsmouth or Bristol, it would sail from there to the coast of Africa, make as many stops as necessary to round up by force as many people to become slaves as they could gather, and then take them across the so-called Middle Passage, the Atlantic Ocean, to slave auctions and ultimately to be worked, in many cases, to an early death on plantations in the Caribbean. In the case of the Zong, this ship had an especially long and arduous voyage. It took many stops along the coast of Africa before they could capture sufficient numbers to pack the ship for the voyage to the Caribbean. And that meant that those who had been captured early were on the ship the longest and most susceptible to disease and privation and abuse that people were subjected to on such voyages. As the ship approached the Caribbean, the captain of the ship made a cruel and cold calculation. He noticed that among the hundreds packed into the holds as slaves, those who'd been there the longest were in terrible shape. Many were emaciated, in terrible health, full of disease, had lost a lot of weight. He knew that if he proceeded to port and tried to sell all those people, many of them wouldn't fetch a very high price. So he decided if he got rid of some, he could actually put in an insurance claim and make more money. So he ordered that 132 living beings be thrown into the sea. This was not uncommon at the time. But in this case, they were crew members of the Zong who had a conscience. And when the ship returned to Britain, some of those crew members talked. They caught the attention of a man named Granville Sharp, an attorney in London, who was so outraged at what he had heard, he decided to file murder charges against the slave ship captain. This case got a lot of attention. But in the end, the judge dismissed the case, and he used these words. He said, throwing 132 people overboard was like nothing more than throwing, as he put it, horses overboard. This was simply, he said, a civil dispute between a slave ship captain and an insurance company. Well, people of conscience were outraged. And at that time, at Cambridge, there was a professor who was in charge of determining what the annual topic would be for an essay contest that involved a very coveted and well-known prize. And this professor decided that this year, the topic for the essay contest would be resolved that it is wrong for one man to own another. A young student named Thomas Clarkson decided to enter the contest. He had no knowledge of slavery whatever, no opinion of it when he started, but he was a diligent student. He wasn't going to simply write something rhetorically and argue one way or the other without lots of evidence. So he went to Bristol and to Portsmouth to try to find crew members who would talk about what it was like to experience, to see this institution of slavery in its infancy as these ships took captured people to islands in the Caribbean. He wrote an essay in which he argued strenuously that slavery was morally wrong, inhumane and cruel, and that it was a stain on the conscience of the British nation. He argued that it must be abolished, and he won first prize. And then a few days later, as he's traveling by horseback from London to his village of Wisbech, something happened. Something happened, and in fact, on that very spot where this happened, to this day, you can see an obelisk that makes note of what happened. Clarkson wrote about it in his diary later. He said as he was anguishing on horseback over what he had learned, there came a point on this journey when he got off of his horse and fell to his knees. And he wrote in his diary later, I said to myself at that moment, if what I have written is true, someone must see these calamities to an end. Now, he couldn't have known what life would bring him, but we now know this young man spent the rest of his life, 61 years, on behalf of the cause of human liberty. First, it was to end the trade in slaves. Later, it was to end slavery itself, which was finally accomplished when he was in his 70s. He lived for 13 more years, and guess what he did? In those final 13 years, he devoted his time, his energy, and his resources to founding and nurturing organizations that would help improve the lot of those who had been enslaved. But you know, in the 1780s, this was a pretty tall order for a young man, not much older than any of you, to take on this institution that had been widely accepted and practiced for centuries. Plenty of people in Britain had been making money off of it. The law not only permitted it, sanctioned it, but promoted it in some cases. And slavery was not visible within Britain itself, hadn't been since 1770. So, you know, the average Brit didn't see it firsthand. He couldn't walk down the street and see it and be appalled by it, which meant that you were susceptible to the pro-slavery forces giving all these assurances about, oh, that's really not so bad, we take good care of them. But here's this young man as a student who decides he's going to get this institution of slavery ended. He's going to change the conscience of the people. And so after this percolates in his mind for a time, it was in May 1787, around a table at a print shop in London, when young Thomas Clarkson assembles 11 other people and forms the world's first think tank. That's important to me because I wrote one. He was the first. It was called the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. A genuine think tank, because they knew that before they could ever change public policy, before they could liberate tens of thousands of enslaved human beings, they would have to change thinking. They would have to produce literature. They would have to go door to door. They would have to preach and teach and educate people, get them fired up, make them understand the nature of this institution and the importance of getting rid of it. He looked around and to try to find who would be allies in this cause. In fact, most of the other 11 around that print shop table in May of 1787 were from the only group within Britain that was in any meaningful way speaking out against slavery at the time. They were Quakers. There's a great book that I urge you to take a look at if you're interested in this, the history of this movement, by Adam Hochschild. Came out less than 10 years ago, and it's entitled Bury the Chains. And he talks about how difficult it was for Clarkson to find anybody who would join his cause in those earliest of days, except among Quakers. But Quakers were written off by British society as, you know, they're oddballs. They're not in sync with the way the rest of us think and behave. Those Quakers, so many Brits thought, you know, the Quaker men have this annoying habit. In the presence of nobility, if they thought they could get away with it, they would not take off their hats because they believed that that would offend an even higher authority. So Clarkson and his merry band of mostly Quakers formed this think tank, and they're going to change the world. What a tall order. The first thing they have to do is to take his essay and translate it from the Latin, which he had to write it in, into English, publish it, and distribute it. That's the first of many publications. And Thomas Clarkson himself, over the next 20 years, will travel around Britain more than 35,000 miles by horseback, gathering evidence, taking testimony, rustling up signatures on petitions. If you saw the movie Amazing Grace, you may recall the moment when William Wilberforce, as a member of Parliament, unfurls that massive petition with hundreds of thousands of names on it, people who had signed saying, "Stop slavery." It was Clarkson who rounded those signatures up, for the most part. Clarkson was, in fact, among the few who first met with Wilberforce in 1787. He was a young man in Parliament who really hadn't spoken out on much. He didn't seem to be a politician of much conviction, but they thought that he was a diamond in the rough, that he had the right instincts. And it was Clarkson and some friends who went to Wilberforce and said, "You need to be our man in Parliament. You need to stick your neck out and introduce the bill every year until it passes that will end the trade in slaves." And they quickly convinced him to do so. And he becomes a great advocate for this cause. Clarkson, you may have seen this in history texts. Do you recall ever seeing a famous sketch of what a slave ship looks like? If you look at it from a foot or two away, you see a lot of black lines. You look closer and you realize these are all people. They're chained one to another, packed like sardines into these ships. Well, that was Clarkson's idea. He had to make slavery real to people. He wanted to show them, see, here's just a glimpse of it. How would you like to be in this kind of situation? He went to a pottery entrepreneur whose name you'll know, Josiah Wedgwood. And he said to Wedgwood, "We know you're with us. We need you, or your folks in your factory, to design some kind of an image for us that can be a symbol, a logo, we would call it today, for our movement." And Wedgwood comes up with this incredibly memorable image that appears on plates and mugs, and if they had t-shirts, I'm sure they would have had it on t-shirts. It was an image of a kneeling black man in chains, with his hands in prayer. He's looking skyward, and around the perimeter of wherever this image appeared were the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" That helped to make this real to people. They weren't talking about something abstract, they were talking about real people. Clarkson, on many occasions, during the next 20 years, from the time he founded the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, will put his life on the line, beaten to nearly within an inch of his life on the docks of Bristol, England, by hostile slave ship crew members. Wilberforce also threatened many times, but in the first few years, as they worked to change the conscience of Britain, they were actually gaining ground in Parliament, more votes each year. Still a long ways to victory, but by the early 1790s, they were an impressive movement. And then along comes a calamitous event that would cause a lot of people, I'm sure, in similar circumstances to give up, but not them. That event was war with France. Long series of wars, in fact, that would culminate, the last 16 years of which would be dominated by the historical figure of Napoleon Bonaparte until Waterloo in 1815. But when this war broke out in 1793, you've got parliamentarians who are pro-slavery now attacking Wilberforce and Clarkson, saying, "You guys are traitors. If we abolish slavery, we'll simply hand this lucrative business over to the French. You're traitors." They never gave up. One of the lessons of this great movement is, once you know something is right and true, don't you ever give up. And don't ever take any obstacle, any barrier, as a sign that you should be in any way deterred. Thank God they didn't. They fought long and hard, through many moments of despair and disappointment, until the great day came, depicted so beautifully in that movie, Amazing Grace. The movie doesn't tell you this, but it was at about 4 a.m. in the morning, in February of 1807, almost 20 years since they started this movement. Around 4 a.m., when Parliament passed, and not by a slim margin, by an overwhelming margin for the first time, a bill to end the trade in slaves. One of the most magnificent moments in the history of human liberty. Clarkson and Wilberforce, given all that they'd been through, could have said, and maybe you couldn't have blamed them, 20 years of this, let's do something else. Maybe the next battle can be led by someone else. But they knew and resolved at that moment, in fact, to recommit themselves to what would be the ultimate victory, which was not simply the ending of the trade in slaves, but the liberation of those who had been enslaved, the ending of slavery itself. Guess how many more years it will take before they accomplish that? 26. So for Clarkson and Wilberforce, this is a 46-year battle. But that great day finally came in 1833. 3 days, in fact, before William Wilberforce would die, when Parliament passed a bill to liberate all of those within the jurisdiction of the British Empire who had been enslaved. Huxchild, in that book that I recommended, Bury the Chains, talks about what happened on so many of those islands in the Caribbean the night before the bill took effect in 1834. Many of those enslaved people went to the highest point on those islands because they wanted to be there when the sun came up the next morning. Because to them, this would be a new day in more ways, more meaningful ways than just one. Clarkson was well into his 70s, devoted the last 13 years of his life to improving the lot of those who had been enslaved. When he died at the age of 86 in 1846, the funeral for a man who was once ridiculed and attacked and dismissed, the funeral for him was one of the largest that London had seen in decades. And Huxchild reports what happened on that day, attended by so many of the sons and the grandsons and the daughters and the granddaughters of the Quakers who had enlisted early in Clarkson's fight. Those Quaker men took off their hats because to them this was a genuine hero for human liberty. One of Clarkson's biographers, Ellen Gibson Wilson, sums him up so beautifully in this line. She says, Thomas Clarkson, 1760 to 1846, a man who gave his life to liberate those he never met from lands he never saw. What a hero for human liberty. But I want to tell you about some more. How many of you have heard of the name Fanny Crosby? Anybody know who Fanny Crosby was? Okay. Fanny Crosby, one of the most remarkable women in American history. And one of the saddest commentaries I can think of today is that most Americans don't know who she is. Less than 100 years ago, she was still alive, and she was the most revered and respected woman in America. She lived from 1820 to 1915, died at the ripe old age of 95. Why was she so remarkable and worth remembering? Well, several things. One, Fanny Crosby was noted for her extraordinary charitable work in difficult places. In New York City in the 1870s, when the city was struck by a terrible cholera epidemic, thousands had fled the city to escape it. She stayed behind, ministered and nursed the sick, contracted cholera herself, but later recovered. Well, that alone would get you at least a footnote, you think, in the history books. But there's a lot more to Fanny Crosby. Fanny Crosby was also the first woman to address the United States Congress. That tells us she must have been a person of some note. How many of you have met one American president?
Ron Paul.
One who should be president. Wouldn't you agree that if you could somehow meet somebody who met 5, that would be a pretty remarkable person who could say, either when they were in office or before or after, could say, I met 5 people who were president. Well, Fanny Crosby holds the record to this day, as far as we know, for having met and come to know more presidents than any other American in our history. We've had 44. How many do you think Fanny Crosby might have met? 21, she met every president between John Quincy Adams and Woodrow Wilson. Adams, well after he served in the White House, he was in Congress for 17 years after he was President of the United States. Well, that should suggest, you know, I mean, there's a lot of those that we don't care much for, but still, there must have been something special about her to have been sought out by so many people of high place. Fanny Crosby, to this day, holds the record, as far as we know, for having written the lyrics to more tunes or songs than any other person ever. Almost everything she wrote was a hymn. She wrote almost 9,000 of them. On any given Sunday to this day, there may be millions of Americans singing Fanny Crosby hymns. Blessed assurance, to God be the glory. But the most remarkable thing about Fanny Crosby, I haven't told you yet. She never had any memory of having seen a thing. She was completely blind from the age of 6 months. And when she went around the country speaking to audiences, and when she talked to the Congress, guess what her message was? It wasn't, I'm down and out, I've got a problem, where's my check? Her message was, as people who live in liberty, we are called upon to use whatever talents and abilities we have, in spite of whatever shortcomings or handicaps we have, to be the best examples we can be for others around us. What an inspiring message, and yet she's almost forgotten to this day. The third person I want to tell you about happens to be my favorite president. And I've written enough about him that maybe this won't be too new to some of you, but it wasn't a recent one, certainly not among the last 2 or 3. My favorite was a man named Grover Cleveland, America's 22nd and 24th president. The only one to serve 2 terms that were not consecutive. Why do I like him? A lot of reasons. One is he vetoed more bills than all the previous 21 presidents combined. And the best of the many Cleveland vetoes was of the Texas seed bill in 1887. It would have given 10,000 federal dollars, probably about $2 million in today's dollars, to drought-stricken farmers in Texas. He vetoed it. And in his message, he said, I can find no warrant in the Constitution for the appropriation of public monies for the relief of private distress. Can you imagine that? A president who actually put his hand on the Bible, swore to uphold the Constitution, and then did it. How remarkable. In that same veto message, Cleveland goes on to say, though the people may support the government, it's not the duty of the government to support the people. And in the next paragraph, he talks about how we must rely upon the charity of our fellow countrymen in times of distress. America can always be counted on to do that. That was Grover Cleveland's feeling. He wasn't the type who would show up at a disaster scene and say, oh, well, I'll be right back with some more money. I'll get you something from other people. No, he would rally Americans to come to the aid of their fellow citizens. It wouldn't occur to him to launder the money through some Washington bureaucracy and spit out a fraction of it to help people and then remind them who to vote for the next election. I mean, he would never think of that. Grover Cleveland came to almost always the right policy conclusions, a few exceptions. Almost always the right policy conclusions, not because he was a PhD, never went to college. He wasn't an economist, and yet he stood on the right side of almost every major economic issue of his day. He was against the welfare state. He was opposed to cheating people through unsound money. He was in favor of free trade, low taxes, low tariffs, all the right things. How did he come to the right conclusion without having read much or studied much or have a degree in any of that stuff? It was because he was a man of solid character. He would judge everything according to what, in his gut, told him was right versus what was wrong. How refreshing is that these days? You could not go to Grover Cleveland and say, well, you ought to take this position because this group over here is talking really loud about it, or you know, it would really help in your re-election, or hey, your party's saying you ought to do this. He would have none of that. he would ask himself, well, what's the right thing to do? I know exactly how he would have voted if he'd been a member of Congress when the TARP bailout bill came up. I know exactly what he would have asked himself this. Is it right to take $1 from the guilty and give it to or from the innocent and give it to the guilty? Is it right to take $1 from the responsible and give it to the irresponsible? No. And then he might have asked himself, is there anything about doing that 1 trillion times that might make it right? And I'm sure he'd say, no, it just makes you 1 trillion times more wrong. Well, he drew from his character to come to the right conclusions. Great man. I had the good fortune, incidentally, of meeting his son. Would you believe? It's just a little footnote here, but I met Grover Cleveland's son in 1995. Think about that. Grover Cleveland was first elected president in 1884. And in 1995, when I learned that a son who was born in 1903, when Grover was 6 years gone from the White House and was 67 years of age, he and his wife had their 5th and final child. That was the one I met. He was 92 in 1995. He was named Francis, named for his mother. And when I spent the evening with him, with a colleague, whom some of you know, Dr. Bert Folsom, we asked him a lot of questions. And one was, I said, Francis, you know, you have to understand how thrilled we are to meet with a guy whose father, not grandfather, whose father was first elected president of the United States 111 years ago. How is that possible? I'm talking to his kid. And here's what he said. He said, well, Clevelands tend to marry late and have children late, and so that's really nothing. My grandfather, he said, Grover's dad, was a baby when Thomas Jefferson was in the White House. I looked it up later and he was. He was born around 1805 when Jefferson was in the White House. So in 1995, you could still be talking to a man whose grandfather was alive when our 3rd president and author of the Declaration of Independence was in the White House. What a young country we are. So Grover Cleveland, a man worth knowing more about. And a recent biography of him I can highly recommend. The title is very instructive. It's entitled The Last Jeffersonian by Ryan Walters. And finally, I want to tell you about a man that I know personally, still alive. I will see him, in fact, in about 3 weeks. He just turned 103 on the 19th of May this year. His name is Sir Nicholas Winton, W-I-N-T-O-N. Google him and you'll find a lot about him. There's even been an Emmy Award-winning documentary done about him. What a hero. Here is Nicky Winton's story. In 1938, Nicky Winton was a stockbroker in London in his very late 20s. 38 was a pretty important year. If you remember your history, you know that that was the last full year before the onset of World War II. Many momentous events happened that year. In March of 38, Hitler annexed Austria. During the summer, he started rattling his sabers against Czechoslovakia. There was a conference in Munich in September of 38, attended by the French and the Germans and others, and that's the conference that Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain came back to Britain from. And on the tarmac, waving that piece of paper, said famously, "We have peace in our time." Because he and the French had basically said to Hitler, well, go ahead and take the Sudetenland, the border area of Czechoslovakia, and just promise us you won't go any further. Well, Nicky Winton, a businessman who had his head on straight, and he knew that Hitler was not going to be appeased and that there was trouble brewing. But nonetheless, he planned a Christmas vacation for late 1938 to Switzerland. But shortly before going, he was contacted by a good friend of his who was working in the British Embassy in Prague, Czechoslovakia. And his friend said, "Nicky, don't go to Switzerland. Come here instead. There's something you must see." He prevailed upon him, and Nicky went to Prague, and what his friend wanted him to see were refugee camps in and around Prague at the onset of winter, with thousands upon thousands of mostly Jewish families who had fled, in some cases, Germany, Poland, other cases, the Sudetenland of their own Czechoslovakia, that had just been occupied by the Nazis. There they were, gathered in these freezing conditions in this tent city. And Nicky's walking through these refugee camps and hearing all these stories about what these people had endured, what they want him to do. Guess what they ask him to do? Plead with him to do. He's a perfect stranger. He is struck by parents coming up to him, in some cases with infants, pleading with him as a perfect stranger, can you please get my children out of the country? They knew that they couldn't get out. There was not a country that would give them visas. The official policy of the world was, hey, peace in our time. We can't acknowledge that these people are in any harm or in any danger. So Nicky sees this. He could, if he had been a man of lesser character, he could have said, well, what can one man do? I'm supposed to be on vacation. I wish I could help. Best of luck. But he immediately swung into action. He's a man to this day of absolutely impeccable character. He immediately sent telegrams all over the world to heads of state, pleading with them. These people are in desperate straits. If I can get the children out, will you allow them to come to your country? Guess how many countries told him, yes, they can come here? Only 2. His own Britain and Sweden. Only 2. Britain tells him, well, yeah, you can bring them here, but you have to find foster families for each one who will take care of them while they're here. You have to put $3,000 in today's money, the equivalent on deposit with the Home Office, so that we don't get stuck with the bill to send them back, because we think this is all going to blow over. Didn't blow over, as you know. In fact, almost none of the children that he will ultimately save will ever see their parents again. And in the documentary, there are gripping scenes of the actual film footage of parents at the train station in Prague giving up their children, taking them back, and then saying, oh, I got to do it, got to give the kids to this Mr. Winton. What a painful separation, not knowing if you'd ever see your children again. Before it was all over, Nicky organized 8 transports, 8 rail transports, totaling 669 children, got them out of Prague, and ultimately, in almost every case, to Britain. A few went to Sweden, and to foster families, where he placed them. The only reason he couldn't talk about this for another 50 years when it was all over is because of what happened to the 9th transport, the biggest of them all. He had 250 kids. After getting 669 out, he had, in this 9th transport, 250 more. Already spoken for by foster families in Britain, on the train in Prague Station, ready to go on the 1st of September, 1939. The day that war broke out. The Nazis stopped all transports. Not a single one of those 250 children survived. All sent to Bergen-Belsen and to Auschwitz. Nicky Winton joined the RAF and fought for 6 years. Later, met the woman who became his wife. Didn't tell her for 50 years about what he had done. The children all growing up not knowing who was it that got us out. Until in 1988, his wife is going through the attic and she comes across a box full of visa document stuff and a scrapbook full of names, hundreds of names. She wants to know, what's all this? And he finally tells the story. And then one thing leads to another, and there's this wonderful moment in television history. It's a part of this documentary now about Nicky. A program in Britain at that time in 88 or 89 called That's Life, where, and we've had something like it here, where they focus on a particular person and tell his or her story and have some surprise guests in the audience, maybe a long-lost loved one. Well, the television studio or station had gone through that list and tried to find as many of the children as they could. They found hundreds of them, now in their 50s and 60s. And so in this television show, as the hostess is explaining to a nationwide audience what Mr. Winton had done 50 years before, she says at one point, if you are among the children that Nicky Winton saved 50 years ago, will you please stand? Well, every person in the audience stands because they had found those children and brought them to the studio. And for the first time in 50 years, they're united with the guy who saved their lives. Here he is now, all these years later, at 103 and a half. His wife has passed on, but he still lives by himself, still gardens. I took 3 students over. The last time I did that was a year ago, February. So he would have been 101 and a half or thereabouts at that time. And I called him a month before and I said, Nicky, you're going to be around. I'm bringing 3 more people over to meet you next month in February. And he said, well, I'm going to be in Prague for part of the month. What day do you come in? So I'll be sure to stay here. I mean, this is a guy who has endless vigor. And when you meet him and you say, Nicky, what a hero you are to so many people. 5,000 people were alive over the years because of what he did. When you add up the 669 that he saved and their kids, 5,000 people plus, including members of parliament, great philanthropists, engineers, scientists, medical doctors, physicists. You say you're such a hero, and he's quick to say, no, don't call me that. The papers in Britain call him Britain's Schindler. He doesn't like that. He doesn't want, he says, I just did what I could. Surely others would have done the same. But I don't think so, do you? It takes a man of special character to do what he did. And thank God the world still has some. Because if we are to win this battle for liberty, we must have men and women of character, like the Nicky Wintons and the Fanny Crosbys and the Thomas Clarksons and the Grover Clevelands of the world. And finally, I just want to share quickly with you a story because it relates directly to you. I think of this story when I talk to audiences of young people in particular. And it goes back to a visit I made to Poland in 1986. I did a lot of work behind the Iron Curtain in the late 80s in countries active with people who were involved in underground resistance, anti-communist organizations. 86 was a difficult year for Poland. It was 5 years after martial law had been declared, when the communist regime cracked down, banned the organization called Solidarity, a youth group called Freedom and Peace, locked them up, threw away the key. And it was 3 years before the big changes in '89 that almost no one predicted, like the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this was a dark time for Poland. But I spent a couple of weeks with people who were active in the opposition, underground, staying at a different home every night, a step ahead of the government. One night I was with underground printers, all young people, not much older than you, active in translating and printing illegally and distributing illegally great works of freedom from the West. I asked them at one point, where do you guys get all the paper to print this stuff? Because the government owns all the printing presses. And a young Pole named Pavel answered this way. He said with a smile, the Polish people have a great sense of humor, even in the midst of great adversity. He said, we get the paper from 2 places. 1, we smuggle it in from the West, and 2, we steal it from communists. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, the government has its own printing presses where they print their stuff, their propaganda, their magazines and newspapers. But more and more of the workers there think like we do. And when the coast is clear, they smuggle the government's paper out to us, and sometimes, he said, they even print our stuff on the government's own printing press. The reason why Poland is free today. But the most moving moment of that whole trip was when I was told by my hosts who were escorting me around that one night they wanted me to meet this very special couple. Their names are Zbigniew and Sofia Romaszewski. Still both alive. He is to this day, in fact, a member of the Polish Senate. But they had run underground radio for solidarity in the first 6 months of martial law. When the government cracked down, banned solidarity, they went underground, started broadcasting the message of liberty for Poland illegally, a great risk to themselves. But after about 7 months of that, they were captured, arrested, jailed. He was given 4 years in prison, she was given 3. They were kept in solitary confinement apart from each other for much of that time. And here I was in November of '86 in their apartment, not long after either of them had been let out. And what do you suppose they were up to? Liberty meant everything to them. Even though they had just been released from prison, they were active again with the resistance. Not in radio, in other ways. They knew that at any moment the police could beat down their door, haul them off to prison again. It didn't matter to them. I said to them, well, you're up against the Army, Navy, and the Air Force of one of the world's 2 superpowers. How can you hope to prevail? Doesn't that get you down? Didn't matter to them. It didn't matter to them that liberty might not be won for Poland in their lifetimes. They didn't know that in 2.5 more years, the place would be free. But they were working for it. And at one point I asked them, okay, when you were broadcasting on that radio, how did you know if people were listening? And Sophia answered this way. She said, in a very matter-of-fact way, I was dumbstruck the way she was just delivered it as if it was no big deal. She said, well, we could only broadcast 8 or 10 minutes at a time, and then we had to go off the air to avoid detection. Go someplace else, set it up again, broadcast 8 or 10 minutes, and then leave to stay ahead of the government. But she said one night while we were broadcasting, we asked people, if you believe in liberty, if you believe in the message of this radio station, will you please blink your lights and call your friends whom you know to be of the same view and ask them to do the same. And she said we then went to the window, and for hours all of Warsaw was blinking. All of Warsaw was blinking. 2.5 years later, when the dictator of Poland, General Jaruzelski, announced to the world at an electrifying news conference that Poland was going to be the first East Bloc country to have free elections in June of '89. He was asked, why are you doing this? This is so earth-shaking. And his reply was, because Poland has become ungovernable. And I knew exactly what he meant, because of people like the Romaszewskis, who did not take no for an answer, did not say, well, I guess we're up against too much, let's just sit back and relax and live out our lives. They loved liberty, and they fought for it, and they won it in 1989. So I want to close by connecting that to you, by saying, you are blinking lights. Each and every one of you is a blinking light for liberty. And I want to encourage you to never, ever let your light go out. Thank you for being so
We're going to take about 10 minutes of questions.
I think I'm between them and the bar, right?
First, thank you so much for your dedication to this cause. That's just amazing. And just on I guess a more practical note, can you like rattle off as many books as you could recommend, either just liberty or anything else?
Yeah.
If you give 10, that would be awesome.
10. Okay. Well, okay. One would be Frederick Bastiat's The Law. That's available on the feed website for free. C.org, The Law by Frederick Bastiat, one of the all-time classics. Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. Henry Grady Weaver's, a somewhat forgotten classic, but it's really terrific and great impact on me. The Mainspring of Human Progress, still available on, I think Liberty Fund now still publishes that. If you like the Clarkson story, I would urge you to read the book by Eric Metaxas, M-E-T-A-X-A-S, called The in the meantime.
What's the documentary?
The documentary on Nicky Winton is called The Power of Good. The Power of Good. If it's, I don't know if it's still available on Amazon. If it isn't, you can find clips of it on YouTube. And so yeah, I hope you can get that, because I'm a little worried that it's not being produced. So it might be tough to find.
What's the best way you think we can make ourselves ungovernable?
What's the best way to make ourselves ungovernable? Well, I always tell people this. I think the first thing we all have to work on, if you want to be an effective spokesperson for liberty, you know, you can't impart what you don't possess. So if you want to encourage people to live to the standards of character that liberty requires, you'd better be a person of character yourself. It doesn't mean you have to go around preaching to people about it. It doesn't mean you have to be preaching. But you should be a person who, by sheer example, others want to learn from, listen to, read about. Leonard Reed, the founder of FEE, this was a message I got from him at an early age. He used to say, I don't know how to play golf. When I show up at the golf course, nobody asks me to, nobody follows me around. But boy, when the names he used at that time, Arnold Palmer, Sam Snead, names you might not know, great golfers. When they show up, everybody follows them around. Why? Because they're an example. So many people who, too many people who are advocates for liberty fall short on this ground. And as a result, they're not as effective or inspiring as they could be. So if you, and I would say also adopt this line of incorporating character as you make a pitch for liberty. And what you'll find, I think, is what we're finding at FEE, is that it subtly appeals to people, resonates with them in ways that so many other arguments don't. If we just argue that, well, you should be for capitalism because it produces the most stuff, then you might make a convert, but he'll be vulnerable to the first person who comes along and says, yeah, but that's greedy and that's not very moral and there are higher standards than that. We have to convince people that capitalism, free enterprise, free markets, liberty, really is just about as high a calling as it ever gets in life. And they require high standards that we should all aspire to. None of the other systems, as I said at the start, do. I might have got a little sidetracked there. I hope I answered your question. Next.
Dr. Reed, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
All right. So it was just confirmed about 8 hours ago that a Students for Liberty conference in Munich, Germany actually brought together over 150 libertarian students. All over Europe, and we hosted one in Brazil. We're working in Africa. We have a charter teams program. We have leaders in Kyrgyzstan. So what do you think are the greatest challenges that we're going to face as Students for Liberty, just as, you know, as a concept, starts to internationalize, and how can we overcome those challenges?
Well, there are several, but I guess I'd have to say maybe the greatest challenge, at least in the next few years, will be the challenge to remain positive and optimistic, because I think we're in for some tough times. The full bitter fruit of decades of statism is yet to be plucked. There may be moments like Wilberforce and Clarkson had when they're pointed to as traitors or nuts or whatever, and there may be a great temptation for us to give up and say, well, I guess we just have to wait for the next civilization that comes along and is founded in freedom. I would just urge you to don't let any obstacle deter you or slow you up in any way. So that's probably the near-term challenge. But depending on the country, there will be endless others too. Statism at the moment has a head of steam, but that doesn't make it right, right? So why would we ever think of giving up? Just think how much greater the day will be when we finally win. Time for any others? Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is just more of a comment. I just wanted to thank you. So many speakers, they present compelling data, and it's really just kind of preaching to the choir. They speak from mind, just intellect, and I could feel so much heart and human energy from you, and I haven't felt this inspired in a while. It's really nice to connect with humanity, and I just want to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, that allows me to close in by just reminding us all that this is about people, isn't it? It's not about facts and figures and cold and indifferent stuff. I mean, this is real people. We're talking about lives at stake. And so that's pretty, it ought to be awfully motivating to us. Liberty saves lives. It doesn't just enrich lives, it saves lives. And liberty, or life, I should say, without liberty is just unthinkable, isn't it? Just try to think for a moment, what would it be like to have life but not have liberty? I would guess if you could ever reach some of those desperately poor and oppressed people in North Korea and ask them, they might give you some glimpse of what it would be like, but I can just barely imagine what it must be like. Liberty is what makes life worth living, and therefore worth sacrificing for, dedicating your lives to, and trying to find the best ways in which we can be persuasive to win over new souls, new minds, and new hearts to this very, very lofty and noble cause. Thank you all for being so attentive. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Clint, and thank you to everyone who has gone through this entire day for everything that you do week in and week out for the cause of liberty on your campuses. Before I actually get into my closing remarks, we have to thank a number of individuals who made this entire event possible. First off, on Students for Liberty's executive board, this conference wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Jose Nino and Andrew Paluzza. And thank you to all of Students for Liberty's campus coordinators here in Texas who helped make this conference possible. In particular, I want to thank George McHugh, Christian Burns, Michael Goldstein, Caitlin Bates, Christina Webb, and Bilal Kamal for everything you did for today. And of course, the one Texan on Students for Liberty's staff who is here right now making this possible, Clint Townsend. Now, I look around this room and I can't even begin to put into words the feeling I have. This is actually my first Texas conference that I've been to, even though we've been running them since 2009. And to think back when I was just a freshman at the University of Pennsylvania, how isolated and alone I felt when I was in school. Like many of you, I stepped foot on campus, and while I was young and ignorant and expected to be surrounded by other libertarians who would make me a stronger advocate of liberty, I didn't meet a single other person who thought the same way as me for the first 2 years. I began to feel so isolated and alone that I actually thought to myself, Alexander, if you're the only one who thinks this way, you must be crazy. Just give up and become a socialist, life would be so much easier. But thankfully, I decided to take a chance. And I started a group, the Penn Libertarians, just to see if there were others out there. Within a year, we had over 200 members on our listserv. Students, even professors, came out of the woodworks. And I realized there had always been libertarians on my campus. There was just no way for us to meet one another. until there was a group that hosted events that would flyer the university, until there were people actually organizing us to get together. From there, I went to intern at the Reason Foundation in Washington, D.C. the year before I started my senior year of college. And there I met other students in a similar position who were running their own libertarian clubs. But at the time, there was no national organization telling us what to do, no handbook on how to start a student organization, no recommended events, all of us had no idea what we were doing, frankly. So I organized a roundtable discussion. Figured, when am I going to be around 50 other libertarian students ever again in my life? 12 of us got together and talked about best practices for student organizing, and it was such a dynamic conversation. I learned so much from them that I said, what do you guys think about making this a little bit bigger? 30 people from the northeast of the United States. We'll see if we can make that happen. And a couple of them said, yeah, let's do it. And at the time, it was an ambitious goal to bring 30 libertarians together to New York City. Other organizations, frankly, didn't think it was possible. But by the time we ran that first Students for Liberty conference in February 2008, we had over 100 students from 42 schools in 3 countries. And that was when we realized there was a demand for this. There were libertarian students, not just at our universities, but not just in the United States, but all over the world, who were interested in these ideas, who wanted resources to promote libertarianism on their campuses. And we decided to turn that one-time conference into a nonprofit organization with year-round resources for students. 4.5 years later, there are over 800 student groups in Students for Liberty's network. We are running 15 regional conferences just like this one all across the United States, plus 5 more in Europe. There was a conference in Munich, Germany going on at the same time as this right now with a comparable number of students. We're getting requests from students all over the world now to start up pro-liberty organizations. We're about to integrate Estudantes pela Liberdade, the Brazilian Students for Liberty, into the Escola International Network. We're working with students in Africa, in Australia, and even more students here in the US starting groups. Our generation truly is the most libertarian generation that has ever existed. We have more potential than anyone before us has ever had to create a freer world. But that potential will only become actuality if the people in this room take it upon yourselves to make that come true. Not waiting for someone else to give you the world that you deserve, but creating it yourself. That's how this conference happened. When we decided to organize the first Texas Regional Conference in 2009, we didn't know what we were doing. Looking back on it, I am amazed we decided to go forward with it because we didn't know anyone in Texas. There were barely any student groups at the time. There was no good reason to organize it, frankly. But we got in touch with Norman Horn from UT Austin. And Norman said he could put it together. And from what we had heard about him, we thought he could too. At the first conference, which had just over 80 attendees at it, we found several individuals who were fresh to these ideas, fresh to the student movement for liberty. Andrew Kaluza and Clint Townsend, who were wet behind the ears. They still didn't really know what they were doing, but they were energetic and enthusiastic. And after that conference, decided to apply for Students for Liberty's Campus Coordinator Program, the first class of it, actually. Because they said they wanted to do more for liberty. They wanted to learn how to be effective organizers at their schools and in their regions, help start up new organizations, identify more libertarian students, and make a bigger impact than they could just sitting in their dorm rooms reading Atlas Shrugged or reading Mises by themselves. Now, Andrew Kaluza is on the executive board. Clint Townsend moved on to the executive board and is now a full-time staffer at Students for Liberty, overseeing the campus coordinator program that he was a part of not too long ago. Everyone starts out in your shoes where you're at right now if you're thinking to yourself that you're too young, you haven't read Human Action yet, you're not sure if you're the right kind of person to be a leader in this movement. Everyone starts in your shoes. Everyone in SFL, Larry Reed started out as a student himself. Ed Crane, the former president of the Cato Institute, was a student at Berkeley. What it takes isn't having read every libertarian book out there. It's not having already organized 180 80-person conference, which this one is now compared to the first Texas conference 3 years ago. It's about having the drive to do it. I encourage everyone in this room to take a lesson from Clint and Andrew and Norman and everyone else who has been involved with Students for Liberty's leadership in making these things happen. And applications to the U.S. Executive Board are open right now if you want to try and make a serious leap into being a leader of this cause. If you want to advance these ideas at your university and nearby schools, our Campus Coordinator Program begins accepting applications in late January or early February. Talk to the campus coordinators here today to learn what they've been doing. Talk with the heads of your executive boards right now. Get more involved. We have the opportunity to create a libertarian future. And seeing the excitement at all of SFL's regional conferences this fall and in this room today, I'm more optimistic now than I've ever been before for what we're doing. Thank you, everyone, and I hope to work with you more.